Um, what I'm gonna do is Friday's class I'm gonna use as I'm gonna give you guys the morning off, so no new material, because I feel we're progressing, especially after what we do today is kind of the hardest part of section 3, or the more confusing combination of things. If you have any questions or things you want me to go over again, like could you go over transverse, could you go over this and that, I'm going to use Friday's lecture. So I'm going to post a lecture, a brand new lecture, but it almost kind of be like a summary Q&A of where we are, just to make sure going into the break we have all of our questions answered. Because guys, when we get back from the break, it's going to be crazy looking at the schedule. Like, we have a week of class, which I'm going to actually start not new material, but muscles, content for unit 4 stuff, how muscles influence motion. Then we have our exam. Then I think we have like 2 weeks, maybe. I mean, it's crazy. So that's what we're going to do on Friday. I'll send out a class email. I have virtual office hours today and tomorrow, meaning you need something, text me or call me, and we'll figure it out. Okay. I figured by now everybody's had a chance to go over their test. And if you still want to go over it, you can when we get back from the break. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I am forgetting. Any questions before we start on today's lecture? Any follow-up? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have that picture with all the different movements of the scalpel? Or it was I think it was 6 of them from last class.
Yeah. Did you do I have it? Not literally. I'm trying to be silly at 7:30 in the morning. I know that's hard. When I was your age, I didn't want my teacher to be silly at 7:30 in the morning. Have you tried going back and looking at the video?
I have not yet. Probably issue. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you, I guess my point is that let's try that first.
Okay.
If you can see it on the video, then yeah, you can screenshot whatever. If you can't, then let me know. That's a great question, but let's see if the answer is in the past video. Any other questions? I promise I won't be silly. I have no promises. Okay, guys, let's get our thinking caps on. Let's go to work. If you would like to participate, I invite you to get on one knee, and we're going to do a pelvic girdle hip movement, and it's going to tie into our shoulder and scapula lecture today, I promise. Okay. So if you're willing and able, let's get our left knee on the ground. Okay. Left knee on the ground. So our right hip is flexed, our right knee is flexed. From here, what I would like for us to do is left transverse pelvic girdle rotate. Notice how your knee is going to kind of go forward a little bit about your ankle. You notice how your knee kind of goes forward as you transverse rotate. Your ankle is going to have some dorsiflexion, and you're having the pelvis rotate left. And because the right side of the socket is doing a protraction kind of movement like our scapula, does that make sense? So the right socket is kind of pushing the femur forward. Does that kind of make sense? But notice the femur stays lined up. The patella stays lined up wherever it was pointing. Does that kind of make sense? All right, let's get up before we bruise our kneecaps. So what I was hoping to get you guys to see is, as the pelvis moves, my hip moved. As the pelvis moved, my hip moved. When we do, let me straighten up the camera so again. I'm not used to this. We did an example in class previous that made a lot of sense, where if you're trying to translate a segment forward, you're going to have a combination of elbow at the same time as shoulder. And when those two things happen together, they can cancel out each other's rotation and summate each other's translation, and the hand goes forward. Okay. A similar concept happens often in the scapula. Scapular and shoulder movements canceling each other out so that you can reach, grab, move a distal segment forward. And I showed you the pelvis to hip because the first one we're going to talk about is very similar. In the pelvis, I had to do left and right at the same time. I had to have like a retraction of the left and a protraction of the right to mimic left transverse. Does that kind of make sense? I had to have protraction of the left and retraction of the right to mimic a right transverse. This side goes forward, this side goes back, right? Because my scapula is independent, I don't have to do those together. So what I'm trying to show you is that if this is going to sound silly, but I'm trying to mimic this, okay? If I were to protract my scapula and not move my shoulder, my arm would go along for the ride. More practically, it would look kind of something like this. If all I did was protract and didn't, you see how like my shoulder is kind of like at a 90-degree angle, how I see it. If all I did was move the ball and the socket, my 90 degrees would now be here. Does that make sense? So if I want to keep my arm forward, wouldn't I have to horizontally abduct just like I did when I rotated my pelvis? I horizontally abducted. You remember that? It was very similar. So when you're trying to reach forward and your scapula is assisting by protracting, your shoulder is going to compensate that rotation by horizontally abducting. In essence, you're in, but you're protracted. Does that make sense? If your scapula and shoulder didn't cancel out each other's rotation, you would either have this, when they work together, they can cancel out rotation. You can reach forward, grab forward, do things where your distal segment can translate, because without cancellation of multiple joint motions, we can't translate any distal segment. We have to rotate things to translate things. And so we have to rotate at least two different things to make something translate. Here's what I'm trying to say. If all I did was move my wrist, my fist wouldn't go up and down. It would just swing. If all I did was rotate my elbow, my fist wouldn't go up and down. It would just swing. If all I did was rotate my shoulder, my fist would. So it's the combination of multiple things happening that we can translate distal segments like feet and or hands. Does that make sense? Even though it sounds weird, it's very similar to something we've had before, where we did transverse pelvic, horizontal ab. We're doing the same thing, except ipsilateral, one-sided protraction and horizontal abduction. Retraction, horizontal adduction. Think about it. If you did, let's do this experiment, just make sure you don't hit anybody. If you did horizontal adduction, wouldn't like your bicep kind of smush up against your chest? Horizontal ab, get stretched, horizontal ad, smush. Okay? So all I'm saying is that when we're going back, you could even feel the smush because the retraction is going to go with, let me show you from this angle. The retraction is going to go with horizontal adduction. Do you see that? Protraction, horizontal ab, retraction, horizontal ad. Okay. So those work together. When you're in anatomical position, we had the hips working with the pelvis in a way as well. For this one, when our hands are meant to stay in the same place, because remember, scapular elevation depression isn't literally like an elevator. Like we can't translate things up. There has to be rotation. So even though elevation sounds linear, it's really still a rotation happening from the collarbone and the scapula. Okay. So if let's say I had a bucket let's say I had a bucket or a handle of some sort, and I wanted to raise it up. If all I did was elevate my scapula by itself, my arm would be here. So elevation with the combination of adduction, in other words, as my scapula is trying to reposition my socket out, my shoulder joint moves in. And then you can cancel out something that's trying to make my shoulder abduct globally with literally adduction locally. And it could keep my hands in the same position.
When you say abduct, are you talking about protraction and retraction, right?
In this one,
No.
I'm talking about elevation and depression. So like more of a frontal plane concept, that as I'm elevating my scapula, if I want to keep my hands in the same position, not in the same position up and down, but the same position left and right, parallel with gravity, because it's kind of hard to carry a bucket out here, right? You want to have the bucket underneath your shoulder joint. You don't want to do this, because even that's going to stress your arms, right? So you want to adduct to keep it underneath. Very similar to if I were going to do right lateral and my left side spun with my right side. If you think about it, the left side kind of did an elevation type of thing, right? I'm not saying they're the same thing, but it's a version. So if I didn't want my leg to go out, because think about it, my left hip is still in anatomical position right here, correct? If I didn't want my leg to go out and I wanted to stay parallel with gravity, wouldn't I have to adduct my hip? That's all I'm trying to say, just did the shoulder. That as one side is elevating, if I want to keep this long bone parallel with gravity, I have to compensate that. So it'd be something like this. This side would be like the elevation, and this side would be the adduction. I'd have to adduct to go back to anatomical. Does that make sense? So what I want you to do is take note of how your scapula and your shoulder are going to cancel each other out as you do some functional tasks, like reaching forward, or again, lifting something like when you're doing shrugs, which we know is not shoulder, right? But when you're doing shrugs, as the scapula is elevating, your shoulders are going to adduct. Not traditionally, but just as my scapula takes my socket, let's say here's the ball in the socket, and this represents the scapula. As I elevate, the whole thing wants to do this. So if I keep that same shoulder position, my arm's going to go out to my side globally. So I need to adduct to keep it parallel with gravity. Ab, add, ab, add. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if you were going to, you don't always have to cancel out. You would want to summate if like you were trying to reach across your body. So like if I didn't want my hand to stay straight, I could protract and horizontally adduct if I'm trying to reach across my body. But just horizontal adduction alone, see if I can do this. Keep my scapula fixed. Just horizontal adduction alone is not going to get me across my body. It was all scapula. Repositioning the whole shoulder joint so that I could get across my body. Does that make sense? Okay. So that is the essence of today's lecture, how the scapula and shoulder will work together very similarly to how the pelvis and the hips work together for certain tasks. It's just that you can independently move your scapula, whereas for the pelvis, they all had to spin together. Any questions before we do some more practice? Do y'all feel comfortable doing practice? Well, let's review what unit 3. Pelvic to trunk, when the pelvis moves about the trunk, right? Not because of the hips, because of the trunk. So like this kind of stuff. I'm not used to this, sorry. Hello, secret camera. Lego movie. There, that's it. All right. Right transverse pelvic because of left transverse trunk. Left transverse pelvic because of right transverse trunk. That stuff. Right lateral pelvis because of left lateral trunk. Left lateral pelvis because of right lateral trunk. And then like we did the reverse crunches, or like posterior because of flexion, anterior because of extension. Yes, ma'am.
Can you go over the right lateral pelvic associated with left lateral? I guess the pictures on here are just kind of like confusing.
That's okay. Do you mind showing me?
Oh, it's the one where she's kind of like, she's on the where we hold yourself up.
No problem. Let's see. I'm trying to remember if I drew some of that on the board when we had that lecture. I'm still going to answer your question, but there may be some on that lecture. There may be some dry erase board pictures that I did that might help as well. I'll take, what did Brian not draw for 400, Alex? It's way too nice of a drawing for me. So, you might recall these pictures, right? So if I'm off the ground, let's say I'm, hanging from a bar or on a Roman chair, just my feet are off the ground. That's like palming the basketball. And when you're palming the basketball, the only way to spin it is to move the top hand. Okay? So the concept is that if I have left lateral pelvis, it's because my trunk has to bend back to its right. So I think I used one of the little props in class. So like if, bless you, if this was going to stay straight and I was trying to tilt it over to the right, wouldn't it have to lean back to the left? So that's kind of what's happening. If the pelvis is doing a spin to the left, you're not going to break that bar off, right? And keep so this would be anatomical. So you have to bend back to the right. Another way to look at it is right lateral trunk bending is bringing like your right shoulder closer to your right hip, but it's also the same as bringing your right hip closer to your right shoulder. In the slinky world, right? Left lateral bend is here to here or here to here. So it's very similar. I can bend to my right by doing this or by doing this. Awesome. Anybody else? I miss you, Chalk. Yoink, yoink. So cervical, but follows the same rules as the trunk. And remember landmarks. Landmarks are important, not global landmarks. Head goes forward, local landmarks. Ears, shoulders, I'm okay with. Nose, sternum, I'm okay with. I no longer do eyes, because then you can be like, So that's why I like nose. Okay. Any questions about cervical? This is the same as that kind of stuff. And then we get to our upper extremity. Wrist. Let's do a quick little quiz. How many planes can the wrist move in? Good, good, good. So if it can move in 2 planes, then it can move about how many axes? Very good. How many motions will we have to account for in the sagittal plane? 2. How many motions in the frontal plane? 2. How many total motions? 4. Okay. Flexion, extension, and then ulna and radial deviation. What was the trick that I taught you guys about ulna and radial deviation? Anybody want to share? What we got?
Radial deviations towards the bone.
Good, good, good. Is it possible, if you're not an X-Man mutant, can you have the thumb not be on the radial side? No, what I'm saying though, like, can your thumb not be connected to your radius? That's true, yeah. If it is, you're in the circus, or you had a very, very serious injury that needs to be looked at. The wrist doesn't twist. And because it doesn't, the pinky will always be on the side and the thumb will always be radial side. So that's why ulnar deviation will look the same and radial deviation, whether you're supinated or whether you're pronated. Doesn't matter. It's always going to be thumb and pinky. Does that make sense? Okay. The wrist does not twist. So flexion, extension, ulna, and radial deviation. Well done. Pinky side, thumb side. Or ulna side, radial side. 2 different forms of the same thing. Because if I could see how some students are like, why do you say pinky and thumb if the motion is ulna and radial? Just say, well, pinky is always ulna, so ulna deviation, and thumb's always radial deviation. Or we can try to change the verbiage to pinky deviation and thumb deviation. I think that'd be kind of cool. Flexion, extension, flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to, that kind of stuff. Okay. How many motions can the elbow do? Good. I think it's a similar question, or I say a similar, it's not even tricky if you know it, and I know everybody that comes to class on the regular is going to know this, but on unit 2, I said, how many motions can the ankle do? And some people put 4 because they think in subtalar his ankle, which I understand, but that's why I'm trying to teach you not to. So I could see how some people who either didn't listen to the lectures or haven't been studying might say, well, the elbow can do 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I could see how these things can get confusing. Or maybe the wrist can do 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's why it's so important to teach you guys this illusion of this is literally a specialized pivot joint that's meant literally to reposition your hands 180, because we do a lot of cool stuff with our hands. And that's our radial ulnar joint, okay? So our elbow 100% does 2 things: uniaxial hinge, flexion, extension. Our radial ulnar joint is also uniaxial, but it's not a hinge. It's what we call a pivot, or Latin trochoid joint. But it's a revolving door. It's a spinning door. It's a pure rotational door, not like a non-pure rotational door that has a hinge on one side and there's literal work that happens when you open it or close it. It's a revolving door. It's a spinning door. It's uniaxial, but it's about its transverse plane. So there's going to be pure rotation or pure rotation. Atlas axis is the same thing. It's a spinning joint. It's meant to have pure rotation. Okay? What was the trick for the radial ulnar joint? Very similar. No, please. Relative, the thumb, relative to what? Yeah, absolutely. So in anatomical position, we know distally further away, that the thumb, thus the radius is going to be lateral to the elbow, which is cool because the radial head's always going to be lateral. But when we have full pronation, the distal radius now becomes on the medial side of the elbow. So in other words, the head of the radius is still lateral, but the feet are now medial. That's how you can tell. That's how you can tell. Whatever position you're in, that's the inside. Doesn't matter. That's how you can tell. Semi-prone was midway, right? And I gave you a trick to check to see if you're fully supine or fully prone, and that's literally whatever position you're in. Can I move in any direction? Do I have range of motion there? If you're in a certain position and you can supinate or you can pronate, then you're somewhere in the middle. You're not all the way here. You're not all the way there. Make sense? Should we ever trust global landmarks like supination is when you do a soup bowl? No, because in this case, my soup bowl is facing the ceiling like all good soup bowls might do. But when I'm overhead, my soup bowl may be facing the ceiling, but I'm prone. I'm here. So in other words, if I take the soup bowl and I flex, would not dump the soup out, the bowl would dump it out. It's no different. So I can't use ceiling and floor and bowls for these kind of things. I have to use local references. I have to use things within our body to analyze motion in our body. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. Let's do a practice one because radial ulna seems to be the biggest trip up on the test. Did we do the driving example yet? Did we do that one? Okay, so let's say you're driving and let's say your hands are 9 and 3. I have to recheck my clock. So they're on to the side. I know nobody drives like this, but it just helps them. Okay. So you're driving like I don't know, you're driving a bus. You start here, you maintain your grip on the wheel, and let's say you make a right-hand turn. Okay. So you start here, totally imaginary situation. Nobody would drive like this. But you start here and you make a right-hand turn, your grip stays on the wheel. What kind of motions, specifically, let's start with the radial ulnar joint, then we can get to some others. Radial ulnar joint motion would allow you to turn to the right and maintain. So basically you go from 9 to 3 to 6 and 12, right? You go from side to side to top to bottom. Left hand is higher than your right hand in that finish position. Give that some thought. Give it some thought beyond that super not practical. Because we all know we drive with our knees. Okay. Again, I can ask questions in different ways, but it's still about the same concept. Did the radial ulnar joints both do the same thing? Yes or no? Very good. We don't assume. The wheel spun the same way, but both radial ulnar joints didn't do the same thing. Okay? Motion, guys, I try to teach my students, which is really unique but I think it's empowering. If you can't see it, you can prove it. Because all we have to do is say, where am I at? Where did I go? And how did I have to move to get there? So we started off in, I don't know, I can supinate from here and I can pronate from here. So I must be somewhere in the middle. True. So I'm at the semi-pronated position. Okay. When I end, we analyze motion joint by joint. Man, my left one can't really go any further. So that meant I must have started semi and ended prone. So my left radial ulnar joint must have pronation. That makes sense? My right, I started semi. I ended, can't really go any further here. So I ended in anatomical or a supine position. So I had to have right radial ulnar joint supination. So my left radial ulnar joint had pronation and my right radial ulnar joint had supination. Any questions? And then, so coming back would just be the opposite, right? Left pronation, and then when I finish my turn, left supination, right pronation. Cool. Any follow-up questions on that?
Oh, not so much that analogy.
Are we going back to the pelvis?
No.
I'm messing with you.
When you did, you had one example where you like a better
Mhm.
so this would be semi-pronated because if you can, it's only supinated or pronated is at the end of the road.
No, so it's technically the only way you can be supinated is if you're in anatomical position. Every piece is a degree of pronated. This midline position is called semi-pronated because it's just such a functional task position. But it becomes, well, am I a few degrees off? Am I right? So then it becomes, well, listen, if you're somewhere in the middle, then it's a form of semi-pronated. So in other words, all I'm doing is saying, instead of saying we're pronated, because I could be fully pronated. So like I'm referencing anatomical is fully supinated. Then you have fully pronated, and then in the middle, you're kind of semi-pronated. But remember, I'm never going to give you one where like, it's always going to be where, we could go kind of, I'm hoping equal parts. So if we did the pledge example from here, you could look at it and say, I'm lined up with my bicep. Or you could say, all right, from here, I could supinate a good 90 degrees. But I could also pronate a good 90 degrees. So I must be close to somewhere in the middle. I think we talked about it when we did this example last week. I think where students miss it is because in their mind, if I have a spoon that is here, if I bring it back down, the spoon should be facing here. But the problem is that my shoulder is not, the spoon isn't like this. My shoulder is internally rotated. So I think what happens is as students want to bring the spoon down, they're extending the elbow, they're externally rotating the shoulder, and then they're supinating and losing track that you're somewhere in the middle here. Does that make sense? Okay, how about this example? I think this is a good one because we can work on a couple things at once. God, with that props. Losing my props. We'll pretend. Pretend. Okay. Baseball bat. Pretend. Okay. So I'm looking, pitcher's throwing this way. Notice what shoulder I'm looking at. My left. So I'm rotated to my left. Makes sense? Anatomical, rotated to the right. Anatomical, rotated to the left. Okay. So cervical wise, if I swing, did my cervical vertebra stay in the same position? Can you see how the first day of class, a lot of students would say yes? You see why it's tempting. Man, nose didn't go anywhere, my head didn't go anywhere. Okay. So I start by looking at my left shoulder. Now I'm looking at my right shoulder. I had to have right transverse cervical rotation. If I didn't, this is what it would look like. If I stay looking at my left, because my head would just go along with my body. I have right in order to keep my eyes and my head level. As my pelvis and trunk is trying to twist my head to look to the left, I have to cancel that out by rotating my cervical to the right. Once again, canceling out motion so that we can have linearity. Make sense? Okay, now let's talk radial on the joint. This is the fun one. Okay, there's going to be radial on the joint motion when I swing. So let's all stand up. We're not swinging. Don't freak out. But I just want you to see the starting position. Okay, so we're right-handed batters. So notice the radial on the joint position mostly. My right thumb is mostly lateral. Does that make sense? My right thumb mostly lateral. My left thumb is mostly medial. Okay. So what I want you to see is when I swing, what happens here when you roll over the bat. And one of the reasons you do that is because when you're swinging, your elbows are going to be extending, right? Well, what's the best way to slow down? We don't want to snap. So when we do this radial on the joint motion, we literally reposition so that a follow through could be flexion. Like literally we reposition it so that we can continue to have motion because that elbow extension is a hard endpoint. Okay. So one more time. When you swing, your radial on the joints are going to help roll over your hands. I want you to tell me what radial on the joint motions would be happening when that happens. Here's a better way to put it if you're not a baseball player, and that's okay. I'm just trying to find practical examples. Left hand is on top of right, and then right hand is going to be on top of left. That makes sense? Left hand on top of right, and then when you roll over, right hand's going to be top of left. We actually did a similar one in class. I feel you. My boys, man, they don't do this now, but because they're too cool. But when they were younger, we played Marco Polo and stuff in the pool, and I'd pretend to be Bucky. Yeah. Hey, everybody, you come to my store and eat all the beaver nuggets and all the food and come to Bucky's and spend all your money. And they would laugh, boy. I'd be like, come to oh, sorry, I get carried away. Family business. They'd be laughing and laughing. I don't know why. In 100 years, we're going to have, let's see what we're going to have left on earth. Chick-fil-A's, Walmart's, probably a few Hobby Lobbies, a bunch of Bucky's. Maybe a Dollar General. Well, whoever wins the wars between the Family Dollar and the Dollar General, they'll be around too. That'll be your options. Okay. Left radial on the joint supination, right radial on the joint pronation. Now, again, I'm not saying there's not other stuff happening, but if we're having a radial on the joint conversation. So if we're having a radial on the joint conversation, none of the other stuff matters. We're only locked in on those specific joints. Does that make sense? We're not, let's see how I used to phrase it. We're not disrespecting the other joint motions. We're just respecting the current conversation. And that is, what was the radial on the joint? We could have an elbow conversation. We could have a shoulder conversation. We can have a scapular conversation. We could have a cervical conversation. We could have any conversation we want. But the trick is that all of these things that are happening sometimes at the same time, we call them simultaneous movements, and sometimes they're happening one after the other. We call that sequence motion. I don't care who you are. It's impossible to talk about them all at once outside of talking about it like a coach would talk about. Like in other words, when we have all these things happening, we call it a swing. However, there's nuances to the swing. There's improvements to the swing. There's limits of the swing. So if you're trying to help somebody improve and they're having trouble, you understanding how individual joints work, you might be able to pick out, oh, there's motion that should be here that's not happening. Let's go take a look at that, or get an athletic trainer. Maybe you're the athletic trainer, to check their range of motion, their flexibility, strength. Okay, so we analyze these things joint by joint. I think I gave, but I'll do it again because I think it's a good analogy. Did I give the analogy about my basketball coach used to scream at me because I wouldn't keep my elbow in when I'd shoot? Ever tell you that story? So we had an old school basketball coach, like old school Bob Knight, screaming, yelling, hollering. And he would yell at me to keep my elbow in when I shot, because in his mind, everybody had to shoot textbook, like the way the textbook said to shoot. So like, you had to, keep your elbow in, put your hand in the cookie jar. I didn't shoot like that. I would shoot with my elbow kind of flared out, like this. And he would scream, keep your elbow in, elbow in. And so years later, when I had some working knowledge, I was like, Coach, remember how you used to yell at me because my elbow was out? And he was like, yeah. He's like, I thought you were being hard-headed. I thought you were being a bad learner. I thought you were being stubborn. I was like, Coach, I have no external rotation in my shoulder. Like I have very little external rotation in my shoulder. So like I had a tough time keeping my elbow in because I literally had a tough time externally rotating to get my shoulder in the position you were asking me to get into. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is sometimes when athletes or people you're working with, sometimes when things aren't happening like they should, maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's a reason that the form is lacking. Or I remember in baseball, I just know now that I'm just a tight person. My dad's like a snare drum. But I remember another example where the coach used to fuss at me because I couldn't keep my toe pointed in a certain direction. And when I would rotate, my foot would drag along. He's like, Brian, you need your toe to point here and here. And once again, I'm a bad learner. I'm being poorly, it's my fault. And I have tight hips. I didn't have the range of motion to follow through like he wanted me to follow through. So I'm just using a couple personal examples that, sometimes when we're working with people, we have to take all this into account, that, maybe there's some reasons. Maybe they don't have certain ranges of motion in certain places, that they need to improve on that. And then they'll be able to maybe do the movement or the pattern or the skill, to their liking, or maybe that's just the way they are. Shaq didn't have to make free throws. He was Shaq. He just dunked on people. By the way, y'all saw that Zion dunk? Look it up. It's pretty cool. All right. So, and then obviously the shoulder and the scapula. Unit 4 is muscles. And during the break, I have old lectures posted. So if you want to go dabble, look at some stuff, you're more than welcome to. Any questions? We're good? You're going to let me know about that old lecture to see if you can see those pictures. Thank you.
So just making sure we have a virtual class part.
Yeah, I'm gonna email everybody. Yeah, so what I'm gonna do is in that email say, hey, if anybody has any specific questions, if anybody has any, maybe you can't see those pictures, right? And look, I went back, I really couldn't see them. Maybe that is where I can kind of take all of those requests and kind of funnel it into one lecture for you guys to have before the break. Cool?
Yeah.
All right, guys, y'all have a good one. Mhm.